America, the land of the brave and the home of the free. But are we really free? America has often been seen by other countries as their knight in shining armor in times of war. But what the world doesn't realize is that behind all the football games, fireworks shows, and patriotism, there is a war of immorality, injustice, and inequality being fought among the American people against the American people. And nowhere can this be seen more evident than behind the walls of our nation's prisons. There are multiple factors causing problems within the American justice system that have been overlooked for far too long, despite being the root of many of our nation's leading setbacks. Two major factors being inadequate methods of punishment and racism. Now, America is no stranger to racism. For decades, people have been fighting for the rights as citizens to be treated equally, and racial equality within the justice system today is still one of the biggest fights for freedom. And with the current trend of incarcerating any and all criminals, regardless of their crime, has led to overcrowded prisons, unfair sentences, and much more. These issues have had severe consequences nationwide. Moreover, society's ignorance to these problems only reinforce the hopelessness felt by those who have been failed by a system designed to protect and promote justice. Therefore, because of the influence of racism in the criminal justice system, there must be drastic reforms to improve the process of incarceration and implement more restorative-based programs to lower the rate of recidivism. Today, I will be analyzing the flaws within the current criminal justice system, as well as how racism adds to the already growing rate of recidivism in America. I will also be discussing the issue with the way the justice system treats and handles drug offenses and why the mass incarceration and unfair prison sentences, the issue with the way the justice system treats and handles drug offenses, and why the current efforts being made to lower the crime rate are not effective enough and only increase the rate of recidivism. Finally, I will be providing possible solutions to reverse the effects that the flawed system has had on America, and I will be bringing in biblical truths to emphasize the dire need for everyone, especially Christians, to act and fight for American justice from a Christian perspective. In order to understand the arguments throughout my speech, I will define a few terms and provide some statistics to explain why we must make reforms to the justice system. First, I will define recidivism, which, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, means a tendency to relapse into a previous condition or mode of behavior. Therefore, when I talk about recidivism throughout my speech, I am referring to when a prisoner is released and recommits another crime that results in another prison sentence. And with the current state of the justice system, the rate of recidivism in America is abnormally high. In fact, the rate of recidivism in America is an astonishing 70% within 5 years of release. In order to decrease this number, we must make changes to the justice system, we must make changes to prisons, and we must make changes to educate ourselves about the underlying issues causing this statistic. With racism being one of the leading underlying issues, statistics show that, quote, Black Americans make up 38% of the incarcerated population, despite representing only 12% of US residents. In spite of being a minority who make up a small fraction of the US population, Black people are overrepresented in our prisons nationwide simply because of a racist stereotype that has unjustly impacted racial minorities. I will also be talking about drug substance abuse disorders. Therefore, I will define what I mean in order to eliminate any vagueness throughout my speech. According to the Mayo Clinic, a substance abuse disorder refers to, quote, a disease that affects a person's brain and behavior and leads to an inability to control the use of a legal or illegal drug or medication. So when I talk about substance abuse disorders, I am referring to the medical disease that comes from the misuse of a drug or other substance that has gone beyond one's own control. Another concept that is key to understanding my argument is understanding what I mean by when I talk about the criminal justice system. This is essential to understand, given the broad nature of the justice system in America. According to the president of the International Association of Forensic Criminologists, Stan Crowder and Dr. Brent E. Turvey, authors of Ethical Justice, Applied Issues for Criminal Justice Students and Professionals, wrote that, quote, the criminal justice system is the network of government and private agencies intended to manage accused and convicted criminals. Now, this is a good definition to build off of, but it's still a bit too broad for my speech. Attorney Michael Hernandez specifically says that the justice system is made up of three parts: law enforcement, the court system, and corrections. That being said, when I talk about the justice system, I am referring to law enforcement, the court system, and corrections as a whole that come together to make up the system that processes convicted criminals in crime. Now that I defined a few terms essential to my argument and provided some statistics about our prisons, I will discuss racism and the detrimental impacts it has had on racial minorities in the justice system. In order to understand the full impact of racism, it is important to understand why there is racial bias in the justice system in the first place. There are several factors that have increased the presence of racial prejudice, media being one of them. Patricia Kim, author of What Must Be Undone, explains that, quote, Black and brown faces are overwhelmingly disseminated by the media in relation to criminal activity. Mainstream forms of media, like TV shows, movies, and news outlets, has made society associate crime with racial minorities. This gives racial minorities the label and stereotype that they are all criminals by nature, because that's primarily how the media depicts them. Furthermore, our attorney and distinguished senior lecturer at the University of Texas, Michelle Dietz, explains that the result of this stereotype is, quote, people of color and the poor are disproportionately represented in our nation's prisons and jails. Furthermore, this racial bias can be traced back all throughout American history, which exemplifies how society has always viewed and treated racial minorities as a threat and how the justice system only reinforces these ideas. From the founding of America, white people have treated people of color as property and second-class citizens with little to no rights. During the mid-1900s, society saw the creation of Jim Crow laws, which were implemented to maintain white supremacy. These laws prevented access to certain places and services from Black people. And what did the justice system do to combat this? Nothing. In fact, they did the opposite. If a Black person were to break one of these laws, the justice system would punish them with, quote, arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and even death, unquote. So by looking at our history, it is clear how the majority of society was never in favor of racial minorities, and it is also clear how this racism has manifested within the current criminal justice system, especially when it comes to overpopulated prisons, as statistics reveal the effects of racial bias influencing incarceration. Mass incarceration only increases the rate of recidivism and reveals the corruption within the justice system. Before I explain how mass incarceration correlates with recidivism, I must explain how this became a problem in the first place. This issue can be traced back decades ago, where there was a new approach taken with regards to incarceration that have produced the effects that are still seen today. Director of Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, John G. Malcolm, explains that, quote, when crime rates soared in the 1960s, the idea of putting more people in prison for longer periods of time made a lot of sense. What was thought to be the solution to high criminal activity back in the 1960s actually had the opposite effect, making the rate of recidivism grow significantly. Since then, the percentage of incarceration has been abnormally high and will continue to increase if we do not make immediate changes, as statistics reveal that, quote, since the 1970s, our incarcerated population has increased by 500%. Not only is this a critical problem, but this is also deeply rooted in racism, as in 2015, about 55% of people incarcerated in federal or state prisons were Black or Latino. The fact that people of color make up the majority of the prison population is no coincidence. Moreover, we can see how lengthy prison sentences has not helped decrease or minimize overcrowded prisons or racism in the justice system in any way. Prison sentences have become unfair, unrealistic, and biased, and are also to blame for the abnormal rate of recidivism in America. Prison sentences throughout the years have become longer because the justice system doesn't realize that longer sentences does not mean less crime, which ultimately increases the likelihood of reincarceration. So why has the time served in jail increased in length? Well, for starters, the influence of fear has impacted racial sentencing, or prison sentencing. Thomas B. Marvel, author of Sentencing Guidelines and Prison Population Growth, explains that legislators have continuously responded to constituent fears by establishing longer sentences or mandatory minimum sentences for wide varieties of crime and criminals. Now, when dealing with criminals, fear is a reasonable response, especially when dealing with those who have committed violent crimes. However, fear is not a justifiable excuse for the fact that people who have committed simple misdemeanors are also serving unrealistic prison sentences that don't fit the degree of their crime. Additionally, the fact that we keep on shoving people in prison, regardless of their crime, means that we will never see a decrease in overcrowded prisons. According to the professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia, Charles Matthews explains that, There are too many crimes with weak or non-existent criminal intent standards that result in morally blameless individuals, and small entities being branded for life with a scarlet letter C for criminal. Released prisoners are truly branded with a scarlet letter that affects them for the rest of their life. This prevents them from finding a good and stable job, decent health care, and building healthy social relationships, and much more. Now, the problem is that those released from prison for committing a small misdemeanor are also branded with this badge of shame and experience the same consequences and discrimination faced by all released prisoners. This is directly linked to recidivism, because without employment and a steady source of income, these prisoners will revert back to crime in order to survive, which increases the rate of recidivism nationwide. Moreover, long sentences may be appropriate for certain criminals, but for most, it's not. For example, drug offenses. Regardless of the degree of severity, drug offenders are usually sentenced harsher sentences, which needs to change. Because, quote, most prisoners are not high-level actors in the drug trade, and most have no prior criminal record for a violent offense. This is why we need to reevaluate and restructure more reasonable sentences fit for the offense, as countless of prisoners are serving an unrealistic sentence. Now, before I discuss the need for effective treatment programs, it is important to acknowledge that there are in fact established programs that exist for treating inmates with addictions. However, they are not effective in the way we need them to be, and that there is still a lot of more work to be done if we want to lower the rate of recidivism. Joseph Califano recognizes that, quote, many states now authorize diversion of lower-level drug offenders into community supervision and treatment programs. So instead of sending these addicts to prison, the court provides an alternative by sending them to a treatment center that focuses on rehabilitation. Now, there is no doubt that the justice system is trying to correct the flaws within their system, but these efforts are not effective and produce no real long-term solutions to the problems that we are facing. Charles goes on to explain that, quote, many states began to face shrinking budgets, rising prison costs, and dangerously overcrowded prisons. So the states that are able to send these prisoners to treatment programs aren't able to develop and improve them because of the lack of funds. This results in poor treatment that is not helpful and have no impact. Joseph Califano also shares that, quote, the treatment they receive routinely fails to meet even minimum professional standards. If we want to see a decrease in recidivism, there can absolutely be no room for error when dealing with life-threatening addictions. Moreover, if these programs are not up to par, they will just end up back in prison with no hope of restoration. Califano also says that the result of poor treatment is, quote, most inmates who have undergone treatment end up back in prison months or even weeks after their release. So what is the point of treatment if it's not effective? Well, there is none, which is why we need to take a new approach at restorative-based programs in America. Now, before I discuss possible solutions, I want to explain the outcome of this lack of rehabilitation. The lack of drug rehab programs in jail only adds to the already growing rate of recidivism in America. Before that, I will explain why they are hardly used. Matthew Charles explains that, quote, we incarcerate, but we do not correct. Again, the justice system believes that the solution to all criminal activity is to imprison all criminals. Now, this may work to an extent, but to apply this to all criminals is wrong and is why the rate of recidivism is so high. Donna Lyons explains that, quote, some 80% of offenders abuse drugs and alcohol, and nearly half of jail and prison inmates are thought to be clinically addicted, end quote. America needs to wake up and realize that this percent will only increase if we do not make changes to make sure that these convicts are receiving treatment. Because without treatment, locking people up in prison is just an act of cruel justice. So by changing the attitude and stigma of drug and alcohol-related crimes, America will see a mass improvement in overpopulation in prisons and a lower rate of recidivism. So the reason why convicts who struggle with substance abuse disorders don't receive treatment is because of the belief that an addiction is not a mental disorder, but a behavior that can be corrected by a prison sentence. Punitive policies around drugs mark people who use them as criminals, which is why they are sent to jail instead of a treatment center that focuses on rehabilitation. This is also why there are overcrowded prisons, as according to the Bureau of Statistics, quote, almost half of federal prisoners in 2016 were serving a sentence for a drug offense, which is 48%. The justice system locks up offenders without even considering that incarceration is not necessarily the answer. In reality, addicts don't need a prison sentence. They need treatment and rehabilitation. Moreover, the first step to overcoming overpopulated prisons is to readjust the way society has stigmatized substance abuse problems. If we can get this down, then we can greatly lower prison population, which will be beneficial to all of society. Quote, "It starts with the recognition that addiction is a complex disease that scientifically proven prevention and treatment programs can counter it. Again, the first step is to acknowledge that addiction is not just a behavior problem, but a major mental and physical health disorder. This shift in mentality will allow the justice system to revert the priorities from incarcerating anyone associated with a drug offense to developing more sustainable and effective treatment, which will decrease overpopulated prisons and lower the rate of recidivism and help those who struggle with a drug addiction." Now that I presented my arguments and analyzed the problems within the justice system, I will provide some possible solutions that I believe will decrease overpopulated prisons, establish more effective treatment programs, minimize racism, and lower the rate of recidivism. In order to decrease prison sentences, we must improve the process of incarceration. Charles explains that we can do this by, quote, "reducing the amount of time that certain offenders are sentenced to serve." Now, this doesn't mean that criminals shouldn't be punished at all, because punishment is vital for restoration, especially for the more severe offenses. However, prison sentencing must be based on external factors, and by doing so, we can make sure that people are serving the appropriate time, which will reduce the likelihood of reincarceration. So instead of sentencing all drug offenders with 5 years and 2 life sentences in prison, the court needs to come up with guidelines to make sure that the sentence fits the crime. Moreover, we also must take into consideration the type of crime committed. Authors of Retributism, Penal Censure, and Life Imprisonment Without Parole, Julian V. Roberts, and Nathaniel Dagan explained that, quote, "sentencing must be based on considerations such as rehabilitation or risk." For example, a thief in prison, a prison sentence won't cure his tendencies to steal. So, which is why we also must consider why the crime was committed. Perhaps he couldn't pay for his mother's cancer treatment and stealing was his last option. Or maybe he couldn't pay back the money that he owes the gang that sold him drugs to because he was in crippling debt, and stealing again was his last option. So, if we base sentences not just on the crime committed, but also how we can restore the offender, then we can improve the justice system. Next problem is the lack of restorative treatment programs. But before we can come up with new programs, we must acknowledge that not all addictions are the same, which Charles states that we first must, quote, "use risk and needs assessments to tailor supervision and treatment programs based on each offender's recidivism risk and particular treatment needs. Only after this can we develop treatments that will be effective long-term." Dawn Alliance authors another way to make sure that we are not incarcerating addicts. She says, quote, "screen felony defendants for substance abuse," end quote. "Even if they're not convicted for a drug offense, the court should make a mandatory screening for all convicts to make sure that they are not needing rehab. Additionally, if we can grasp the concept that prison is not always the answer, we can greatly improve the effectiveness of treatment programs. Because, quote, "by diverting offenders from prison could also save the lives of those who complete the treatment," end quote. So not automatically assuming that all drug offenders need jail will also destigmatize addictions and open the door for addicts to actively seek treatment. Furthermore, we must also work to eliminate racism, and by doing so, we can make reforms to the prison sentences. As, quote, "changes in sentencing could also reduce racial disparities in prison population. Because of the impact that prison sentencing has on the justice system, it can also reduce racial bias. Moreover, there are several approaches that we can take in order to minimize racism in the justice system. In order to eliminate it, we must stop equating crime with skin color and add more diverse representation. Because, quote, the racial composition of a jury influences the outcome that defendants receive," end quote. Because of the influence on jury sentences, if we implement a policy that requires the composition of the jury to represent 2 or more different races, we can make sure that racial bias is not a factor being considered when it comes to prison sentencing. Now that I provided possible solutions, I will discuss the importance for prison reform. While no system will ever be flawless, it is especially important for Christians as we are called to help those who cannot help themselves and make amends to improve an unjust system that goes against God's creation. The Bible calls Christians to act out on injustice. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15 says, "You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you judge your neighbor." It is obvious that the current criminal justice system is full of injustice and prejudice, which is exactly what Leviticus informs Christians to not let occur. So how can you make a difference? Well, for Christians, prayer is always a great starting point. But if you are looking for a more hands-on impact, there are several Christian groups that focus on outreach and bringing the gospel to the hopeless. In an interview with Steve Kunkel, he shares that he's been involved with these programs for over 27 years, and when asked what he does, he explains that he, quote, does Bible studies up in prison in Lebanon. Now, this is just one of the many ways that Christians can get involved within their community and bring the gospel to those who may be hearing it for the very first time. When asked what the goal of these programs are, he explains that, quote, is to go in there and teach the Bible and encourage anyone who comes to embrace what God says and to know Jesus Christ and help them to be an encouragement to all, end quote. Steve Kunkel is helping transform the lives of people who are told and treated like lost causes far beyond the point of restoration. However, through Christ, nobody is too far gone. Scripture points Christians to act out on injustice, love your neighbor as yourself, which is why prison reform should matter to Christians who ultimately honor God by doing so. In conclusion, we have a lot of work to do in order to lower the rate of recidivism and improve the American criminal justice system as a whole. But if we can make the efforts to eliminate racism, reduce prison population, and restore convicts back to society with the intention of glorifying God, we can all make a difference. You can make a difference that can and will change the state of America forever. Thank you.